Well, one of the concerns that has been in the public around here has been the effect of anthropogenic noise, how human-made noise is affecting the behavior of the whales. And that involved the Navy noise, shipping, et cetera, and that noise has increased dramatically over the years, along with our ability to record and to analyze the sounds in the ocean and understand them, both from the pure physics point of view and from the animal's point of view. How do they produce sound? How do they receive sound? What our noises mean to them, and maybe even what their noises mean to us. So Michael Stalker is going to start out the series with an overview of acoustics in the ocean and play some examples. It's a vast topic, and we'll do the best we can. Then Yvonne Barkley will follow with some of her research in Hawaii on sperm whales and false killer whales, and using a technique called a towed array, et cetera. And so we'll get a perspective from some toothed whales that way onto echolocators, onto sound. And then Michele Fournet will follow up and with some humpback whale story and how COVID may have shifted the way they talk in Southeast Alaska. So hang in there, endure. At the end of that, we'll have as much time as we can for questions, maybe a bit of paneling, but probably more questions and such. It can go anywhere at that point. So take it away, Michael.
Wow, well, great. Thank you, Jeff. And I'm just totally honored to be part of this panel, this assembly. I'm a marine bioacoustician, and I was introduced at actually the Oakland Museum as a biocrustacean. And now I don't know what a collective pronoun for biocrustaceans is, but you got a whole handful of them right now. So I'm going to see if I share my screen and make this work here. That one there, and share sound, and let's go. Okay, and I am going to, once this stuff gets out of the way, please, I know I can do this. It happens to be hiding what I need to get to. I'll stop it. Do I wait here? How's this work? It worked before. Let's do it this way. Okay. From the beginning, and now I can expand it. Oops, it didn't do it.
Uh-oh.
We'll get there. It'll work. It did moments ago. So, oh, I see. We're right here. Ta-da!
There you go.
Okay. So the ocean is an acoustic environment, and much like the terrestrial environment is highly visual, sound works so well in the ocean that that we really most of the critters in the last 1.5 billion years have been developing various ways of adapting to that habitat, that environment. And acoustical energy works in a couple of ways. There's a pressure gradient energy, which is what we're and terrestrial animals are mostly evolved to handle. We have like little eardrums, right? The pressure gradients. But animals in the ocean also have particle motion sensors of various types, because their bodies are pretty much at the same, relatively the same density of water. Sound travels through their bodies, so their bodies are acoustically transparent or translucent. And some of them have organs inside their bodies which help translate that sound, like accelerometers. Some fish have these basically ossicles in their hearing organs that act as masses that their body will oscillate against. There's a lot of different adaptations, some of which we probably haven't even discovered yet, of how animals translate acoustical energy transferred through water into their perceptual system. So, and a lot of us, me included, were enticed into wanting to become marine biologists through Jacques Cousteau's early 60s series on this, in this movie, The World of Silence, Le Monde de Silence. And, but unfortunately, the title of the thing kicked my particular field of marine bioacoustics back 10 years at least, because people thought that everything was quiet under the ocean. It's far from it. And so I'm going to play initially some animal sounds, and I can't see the chat screen. It doesn't really matter. I'll just we don't have to participate. Just think about it maybe, and we're going to play some sounds here. All the critters in the ocean, including humans, make sounds and noise. So this is kind of a guessing game. As I can't see the chat window, I guess I'm not going to open it up to that. But I'm going to play some sounds and see if you can kind of think of what they are, and then I'll reveal what they are, and hopefully you'll be surprised. This is a really common sound pretty much in any temperate water. If you stick your head underwater, you'll hear, sometimes it sounds like sand moving around or whatever, but it is an interesting sound because it's so ubiquitous, and it's created by the snapping shrimp, Cragnus nalpheus and Cragnonalpheus, that kind of family, and they snap their claws, and the design is such that they create this cavitation bubble, and that noise is loud as the noise at the muzzle of a 30 caliber rifle. It's like 135 dB, that's gonna be 235 dB SPL, RE 1 micropascal. It's just really loud. And they use it to stun their prey. So they have these little zooplankton that are swimming by them, and they snap, the zooplankton gets stunned, and then they eat them. And but there's so many of these things, it's creating this ubiquitous sound. And there is a colleague of mine who was basically looking at this as acoustical daylight, much like sunlight illuminates our surroundings. He was thinking that this noise was acoustically illuminating the surroundings, which would explain how fish at night, when there's no light, can get around without knocking into things. And he actually proved this in a larger scale. It took a lot of computational power to do it, but it's an interesting thought. We'll never know for sure, but it's a good explanation as to why fish can get around in darkness without knocking into the coral and the rocks and each other and what have you. So. So this is mantis shrimp, and there's a lot of species of mantis shrimp. They're very colorful animals. They have really amazing eyesight, rods and cones, and these guys have 12 different sensitivity ranges of light that they can perceive of, and you can see from this pretty body that maybe you can use it. But what's also marvelous about these animals is they dig these dens, and they live a fidelitous life with their mate of choice, and they'll live up to 20 years. And that is them purring to each other when they're like the whispering sweet nothings. So it's kind of a breeding announcement that they're getting into. But yeah, they're pretty amazing. There's a lot of other amazing things about this. I could talk about these guys for quite a while, but we need to move along to the next wild sound. So you hear also napping shrimp there as well, but you hear these kind of chortles, and that is, fish in a reef. So that's a healthy sounding reef. You hear all these different sounds that happen simultaneously, which gives you an idea of a thing we call acoustical niches, where you have a healthy sound environment has pretty much all frequencies covered. And the low frequencies that you would have otherwise heard in here are probably not, the recording was not necessarily broadband enough for that. But you can really hear how healthy an acoustic, biotic environment is by the soundscape that it leaves behind. So I'm doing a lot of work in soundscape studies and definitions and what have you, and trying to come up with metrics for soundscapes. Okay, fishes. This is a little 6-inch fish, the Opsonus tau, a midshipman. And they, in breeding season, they hum. And there's some really interesting things about their humming. They kind of phase, they all sound the same. So in terms of breeding fitness announcement, I'm not sure if that's necessarily what that role is. It may be just, you know, kind of like crooning, and the female decides on other, because the males are the ones who make the most noise. The females decide on other criteria which ones she would prefer. But it's interesting because then the males will actually, the female will lay the eggs, the male will fertilize them, and then he'll guard the eggs while she goes out. Maybe that's it. She goes off with suitor B after he's stuck with the eggs. So I'm not sure how. I'm sure somebody knows. Somebody's been studying these guys. Okay, this again. These are crocusianas. These animals, they come in a lot of different varieties, but they are very soniferous, and they basically are gamete breeding animals. So they have these breeding aggregations, and that's what we were hearing there. And they all croon to each other and get excited, and at some point in time, the gamete dispersal festivities happen, and that's how they end up doing their thing. Okay, now we have, this is. That's, I think everybody knows that one, humpback whales. And here's it. That's a mystery. You know, one of the challenges of trying to record or identify sounds from various animals is that unless you see them in the proximity of your hydrophone, it's difficult to basically verify that that's the animal that's making noise. But in this case, it happens to be a minke whale. Oops. Yeah. These are the smallest of the rorquals, and they have a pretty interesting phonation vocabulary. They have a lot of interesting sounds to make. And they seem to chorus, and I've been working on trying to get more copies of them. They pulse like crickets. If you speed up their pulsing, it does sound like crickets. And my conceit is that they're synchronizing like crickets, and they're creating a community ear, if you will, acoustic community that they use to convey information to each other. But I only have recordings with a single hydrophone, and I need to have two hydrophones so as to verify whether or not, you know, the time distance of arrival and time difference of arrival of the two microphones would verify whether or not they're synchronizing or not. So anyways, on to the carpet fish. So the old sailors would call these guys the carpenter fish because they sound like a bunch of journeyman carpenters on Friday afternoon, pounding away. And but these animals are acoustically probably, maybe aside from the beluga whale, are acoustically one of the most complex animals on the planet. They have it doesn't sound like a complex repertoire to us because of clicks and bangs and whatever, but the way they project sound in the spermaceti organ in their rostrum and their forehead, or I guess you call it a forehead in this case, very complicated, very complex, and they can basically focus sound, they can beam it, they can do all kinds of stuff with it. And yeah, that's much more to be understood about that. So these are orcas, and they're you know, very cooperative community animals. There's the dodocetes, which are the porpoises and the dolphins, and also oddly the sperm whales. They have teeth, and there's two sounds that you hear. The sounds that we are hearing, the squeals and whatever, are considered social sounds, and they include they're finding out in some cases things like names, embedded names and things like that. So when they're swimming next to each other, they can kind of pass things back and forth through that. But then all that clicking is a biosonar, and they kick out these bursts of high frequency energy that then reflects back to them, and that's how they essentially sense their surroundings, particularly when it's dark and they're hunting and what have you. But there's an interesting study, and I forget who was doing it, but it was a strategic plan where it was the J-pod orcas up in southern resident killer whales, and they were hunting without making any sound at all. So it's like they had somehow strategized. You know, it's a baffling incident. It's one paper too, so maybe it's only one. Oh, okay. So a quick segue here. Once a year, we take kids from a local elementary school out on a boat and record stuff, drop hydrophones in the water, and do science. But they're fourth and fifth graders, so the science, the depth of the science is not very much. But most of these kids, particularly ones from Bayview, who haven't been out in the ocean probably ever in their lives, and they're so just thrilled to be out there. But what we do is we drop hydrophones in the water, and these are some of the sounds we get. This was down in Treasure Island. What you'll hear is the prop of the boat kicking down, but so then you'll hear all this clicking and clacking and stuff like that, which are the critters in the water, and it's shallow. It's shallow out there. So. Yeah, all that clacking is fish. And then this is out in deeper water by Angel Island, and it's a whole different soundscape. So you're hearing a boat, propeller in a boat, but you're also hearing this clacking in the background, which is pile driving, which they're doing continuously throughout the bay to kind of shore up and develop the coastline. So now we're starting to get into anthropogenic sounds, the most ubiquitous of which is from shipping noises. And this really, globalization of trade really started amping up starting in the mid-60s. And Donald Ross did a prediction back then. I think the paper came out in '72, but he said that the noise in the ocean was going to increase, from shipping alone, was going to increase by 2 dB a decade. So right now, the ocean is about 15 times louder than it was back in 1965. And what does that beautiful sound like? That's just one. And there are some 85,000 boats, 95,000 boats registered with Lloyd's of London. And you could say that maybe half of them are in transit at any given time if they're insured. So the ocean is loud. And where those red areas are is where it's the loudest. There's something interesting to say that the North Atlantic right whale, which plies the coast here, is just holding on by its fin tips. Whereas the South Atlantic right whale, which plies here, is actually pretty robust group of the clay. They're doing well. And there was an interesting study. There's Susan Parks was up here and studying. She's got a lab up in the Bay of Fundy area, where she was recording the sounds of the North Atlantic right whales. And at the same time, this woman Rosalind Rowland was checking out their stress levels through cortisol levels in their feces. The cortisol is a proxy for stress. And in 2012, they published a paper because they were both there at the same time when the 9/11 thing happened, and they shut down shipping in the ocean for over a week. And as soon as they shut the shipping down, the stress levels just went dived. And when the shipping started up again, the stress levels came up. So that was a pretty clear correlation between stress and anthropogenic noise that is affecting a whale that is just on the brink of extinction. There's about 400 of them left at this point in time. So, and this is something people don't really think about that much. When you have deep water oil extraction, when they pull oil out of the water, it's not just oil. You saw that red stuff that came up in the Deepwater Horizon. It was horrible looking. It had all kinds of other compounds in it. And so what they do is they take that stuff to a refinery, and then they refine all the stuff out of it. And then comes our gasoline or oil or kerosene or plastic or jet fuel or tennis shoes. All that stuff comes, and lipstick, not good lipstick, but bad lipstick. And but before they pull all this stuff up, they have all these processes down here where they have seafloor separators and multi-stage pumps and all this stuff. And this is creating a soundscape on the seafloor, which and if you could imagine having to live in that habitat with that noise in the background all the time, and you cannot turn it off. So one of the things we've been trying to basically let people know is that it's an ongoing problem, and it will be ongoing as long as we continue to use fossil fuel. Another fossil fuel artifact is they survey, and they survey to find out where the deposits are. But also when they draw down the deposits, they need to know what the disposition of that is. So once they've got an active extraction happening, they'll survey it 2 or 3 times a year, and to the dulcet sounds of the seismic air gun. And that will, anywhere from 10 to 15 seconds, depending upon the depth that they're looking for and the depth that they're in, around the clock, 24 hours a day, weeks at a time, and sometimes months at a time. So we just finished up, actually, the end of 2019. We had monitored a survey up in the Cook Inlet where they were blasting off every 7 seconds, around the clock, 24 hours a day for about 45 days. And the whales left the area, but the other critters that are there that didn't have, the sedentary animals that don't move around, who knows? And this is what really brought everybody's attention to it, which is military sonar, Navy sonar. This is a tactical pinging sonar here, but if you're wearing headsets, you might lift them away from your ears for a second. And that was the noise, Charlie 53 sonar, which was essentially correlated with the strandings of many marine mammals, particularly beaked whales. The first incident that really came to public attention was in the Bahamas, where 17 beaked whales washed ashore. But this particular incident, the 800 terciops, 800 bottlenose dolphins washed ashore after military exercise, all of them deafened. And the pictures are brutal. I mean, why did they wash ashore if they're deaf? And they can still, if they're deaf, they can't live. Their ears are their most pronounced survival organ, aside from their mouth and their teeth. They need to hear. But there's some of these pictures where sharks had bitten these animals because the sharks realized these animals were like messed up, and so they were biting them, getting bites. And so these dolphins just strand themselves is one of the thoughts. They just say, let's just toss in the towel here. And then in our horizon right now is underwater communication systems. DARPA wants to put a positioning system in the entire ocean everywhere. And given the physics of water and sound propagation, high frequencies, whatever, that would mean they would have a buoy maybe every 20 kilometers. And everywhere in the ocean, you'd be on your sailboat sailing on a beautiful night, and you would hear this through the hull of your boat. So it's not loud, but it's anxiety producing. And, oh, it's still going, okay. I'm gonna get off that. And then, you know, there's more kind of comprehensive communication sonars to get stuff done. And there's a lot of different signals, but essentially down here, this is you know, again, one of those fossil fuel extraction operations here. But this is, you know, surveying and all kinds of stuff. And the sounds that those things kick out, this is one of many, but this would be one of them. And again, it would be continuous. And that happens to be in our hearing range, but there's ones that are not in our hearing range, which are in hearing ranges of odontocetes that, again, would create a little bit of disturbance, I would say. So that's, I think, where we are. What are we doing about it? We're doing education outreach, writing a lot of environmental impact statements, standards committees, modeling, propagation modeling, and things like this. Collaboration with artists. So we're kind of a multi-pronged shop here. What I've been working on a lot, the last administration was really bullish on fossil fuel, and it was a grass fire stomping exercise for 4 years. And when they stopped, it's like, oh, well, okay, now it's quiet. And the next thing comes up is offshore wind. And we can talk about that maybe in the panel discussion, but offshore wind is great. It's the fastest way we can pivot off of fossil fuel, but it's not without its liabilities, and some of them are acoustic. So I guess with that, I'm going to say thank you. And I'm going to show my book here for a moment, just so if you're interested in exploring the kind of the phenomenology of sound and sound perception, this was my ova. So there we are.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. Good stuff. All kinds of stuff to think about and wonder about. And Yvonne, jump on in here. You're next.
All right. Hello, everybody. Let's see. Okay. How does that look?
All good.
Great. Thanks. And thanks, Michael, for that overview of such a broad topic, but you gave some really interesting examples, some really enlightening ones of the anthropogenic noise, some I've never heard before. So that was a bit disturbing and eye-opening for sure. So what I'm going to talk to you today about is some of the research I've conducted in the Pacific Island region, which I'll tell you a little more about in a bit, and how I've used passive acoustic methods to study different species of cetaceans here. And cetaceans include the whales, dolphins, and porpoises. Right now, I'm a postdoctoral researcher with the Joint Institute for Marine and Atmospheric Research, and I do a lot of work to support some of the mandates that the NOAA fisheries have to follow regarding protected species. Okay, so the Pacific Island region, it's shown here on the map on the left. This contains all of the different zones and territories that the United States is responsible for in the Pacific Island or the Pacific Ocean. And that includes everywhere from Hawaii to, let's see, I'll try my little laser here. So Hawaii here, down in American Samoa, and there's a bunch of atolls here and outlined in red that are pretty small, but have significant areas of nice reefs and whatnot, all the way out here to Guam and the Marianas Islands. So that's a really big area to cover and study. And we have at least 25 species of cetaceans that we know of. Those include the donocetes, the toothed whales, and the mysticetes, which are the baleen whales. And so most of my work right now consists of data that were collected within the Hawaiian archipelago. And so just to give you a better idea of what that means, some of you, or most of you might know about the main Hawaiian Islands, which are here in the southwest part of the archipelago. And then it spans 2,400 kilometers up to the northwest. which and consists of more protected waters that are part of the Marine National Monument. And so, yeah, there's a lot of species also here as well. There's 25 that we know of, but they all undergo or experience similar threats as other places in the ocean. Those threats include human interactions. Sometimes we have areas where people get in the water to snorkel, swim, dive with these animals. A lot of entanglements can happen, primarily with fishing gear and other types of marine debris. And that, follows with pollution, just either garbage or toxins in the water. They also can suffer from diseases, the morbillivirus, and of course, they are exposed to different sources of underwater noise. And the primary anthropogenic sources here include tour boats from the whale watching tours and other, sunset tours, all that stuff. Fishing vessels, we have a huge fishing industry here, as well as cargo ships, since we get everything. Most things are shipped here via those large shipping vessels that Michael played some examples of, as well as military exercises, or also known as sonar. So we do experience all of those sources of noise. And so it's important that we are able to study these populations, collecting really good scientific information about them so that we can properly assess the size of the populations and the health of these populations. And so that's kind of where my work falls in, where it's the science that we do helps support those management and conservation decisions that NOAA has to facilitate, so that one, we're understanding the human impacts on these animals better, and ultimately trying to just prevent population declines to occur, which has happened in the past. So we're trying to manage this so that doesn't happen again, along with other things that we're trying to learn about these species and their biology and ecology. And so in order to do this, we have a ton of different tools that we use, which is great, and is why I'm really interested in this research in general. So here's a sort of a diagram of some of the different tools we use at NOAA, including just basic visual observations. We have to go out on these boats or even just from shore and visually see the animals. Hopefully we can get close enough to take photos. We can take photos of their fins and their the dorsal fins and their flukes to try to identify individuals. Even collecting tissue samples that can then be used for genetic analyses later to sort of look at their population structure in more detail. And the satellite tagging efforts that are taking place, it's pretty cool because then you can track their movements and actually see what type of habitat they're using, different patterns in that. And a more recent tool that is being used more and more is the unmanned aerial vehicles. And that can help take photos from above and look at things like their body condition, as well as just the size of these groups that we're encountering at sea. And so all of these tools I've just mentioned really rely on the visual aspect of studying these animals, which you think, well, these cetaceans and these animals live underwater most of the time. There's definitely limitations to them. So yes, that is true. And we, especially out here in Hawaii, we have some really rough weather. When the sea states rise, like it's really big swells and strong winds, that can really limit us in, and the different tools on this page that we can actually use. But luckily, since cetaceans make a lot of sounds, that's where passive acoustic monitoring comes in. So cetaceans, they rely on sound to survive, as Michael was describing. They are using it to feed, to navigate, to communicate to each other. And so for my research, I primarily used towed array data, which is this device towed behind a research vessel. In this case, it's a NOAA ship, one of the NOAA research white ships that we have here. And it's not to scale. So usually this array is the underwater microphones shown in the little black dots in the tubes here. So this is usually towed about 300 meters behind the ship. And then we can actually detect most odontocetes of the toothed whales from the highest frequencies to the lowest known frequencies. And then only some baleen whales or the mysticetes, given that some of the, or a lot of the mysticetes sounds are below the noise that we experience with the ship itself. But so with the visual-based tools and this using the towed hydrophone array, one of the main ways that we collect data about these different cetacean species is during a line transect cetacean survey. And so this is a really great way that we can assess all of the different species in one fell swoop. Like it takes about a month to conduct a survey, sometimes multiple months, depending on the year, but it's a way that we can set up these transect lines or these predetermined routes that we can take throughout the study area that are systematically placed. So that helps with our analyses later. To basically, the primary goal is to count the number of animals and estimate their abundance for each of the populations. And we are relying mainly on visual observations to do that at this point. So we need the visual observations to measure the number of animals we see in each group, as well as estimate their distance from the transect line itself, because that just plays into the abundance and estimation later. And so if you watch the ship as it moves down the track line, you can see that, I mean, this might be very obvious, but we get these instantaneous distances because we can see the animals right there relative to the track line. However, if they're underwater, then we can't see them. So in many cases, though, we can still hear them. And that's where my work comes in, because we can get these distances from those groups underwater that are making sounds or producing sounds. And in theory, that would improve our precision on these abundance estimates that we are really relying on to assess the status of these populations. And so how do we do that? Well, first of all, we have to actually hear the animals. So that's step one. And then once we do, we can calculate a direction or a bearing to the animals using the pair of hydrophones that are in the towed array of hydrophones. And then one of the key pieces here is that we really need that animal or group of animals to keep vocalizing as they pass us, because we're moving and they're probably moving. So it's a lot of moving targets, if you will. And once we get all those steps completed, hopefully we end up with a series of bearings over time that then converge to a central location that we can estimate the distance to. And so we have lots of computers are involved in this process and software that's really great in helping us estimate distance. And so these, distance. And so these towed arrays are really useful. During a survey, we tend to be helping the visual observers actually track and locate these animals when they do dive and are out of sight. And then that is just further information that can help improve our understanding of how they're distributed within the region, and also just learn more about their ecology, because it's still data that we're able to collect even if we can't see them. But there is some complications are introduced when we get into the deep diving cetaceans, and these are the species that are diving really, really deep while they forage, including sperm whales and beaked whales and some other species as well. And so part of my PhD work was looking at data for sperm whales, because I'll describe this in a moment, but let's see, sperm whales themselves are really the largest toothed whale and hunting predator on the planet at the moment. So they are a deep diver. They can spend up to an hour at depth searching for prey about 6,000 feet below the surface. But luckily they make sound while they're doing that. And so that's where passive acoustic monitoring is great. We're able to detect their echolocation clicks, which are shown here. This is just a visualization of the sound in what we call a spectrogram. So we have that frequency over time measurement. And what you're looking at are these dark gray lines. And those themselves are the echolocation clicks. And I don't have any sound set up, but my demonstration will just show you what it actually sounds like. So really, if you snap your fingers, you're acting like a sperm whale. And this particular example is of their regular click type, because there actually are 4 different types of clicks they produce. This one is associated with foraging. I'm searching for prey at depth. They are the loudest animal on Earth. I think their highest measured clicks were about just over 200 decibels. And it helps us detect them from far away too. So if visual observers aren't able to see them, we can actually detect them much farther than they can see them as well. So that makes them a relatively easy species to study. And I say that sort of loosely, but their click characteristics help us actually identify them acoustically compared to other species sounds. So that's really one of the reasons why I chose to start with sperm whales in some of my research. And so going back to some of the localization methods I just talked about, I'm just calling that the traditional localization method. Shown here on the left, this is our little ship moving down the transect line, and we've got these bearings to some animals and able to measure a distance. There are some assumptions involved in this part of the, or in this method, where the array is being towed at a certain depth, and we're assuming that the animals are at the same depth so that we can treat this as a 2-dimensional problem. It also doesn't account for any error sources, such as the array itself moves in the water. So that could introduce some inaccuracies in the bearing measurements. There's also the sound propagation effects, where sound can change with depth, depending on where the animals are in the water column. So stuff like that just isn't really accounted for in this type of localization. So because in reality, we have these deep divers that are really most likely below the array at several hundred meters or feet, and it's creating this 3-dimensional problem. And so yes, that can introduce inaccuracies to the measurements. And how do we account for that as the depth of these animals and the errors involved with localizing them? So now I'm going to get a little bit technical, but it's going to be great. So part of the method I developed during grad school was we developed a way to incorporate all of that information, the depth of the animals, the sources of error, into what we call ambiguity volumes. So that's what we say is a more robust method for localizing. It gives us more information, incorporates more information about where these animals are when we're detecting them. And so these volumes here are what we can say is a probabilistic indicator of the whale's location. So these 6 panels here are basically an ambiguity volume stepping through time as you detect a whale down the track line or the transect line, which is the orange arrow. The whale will be our little orange asterisk here. And as you step through time, the ambiguity volumes are multiplied together so that areas where they overlap become reinforced, and then other areas are canceled out. So that's how you can see that as you step through time, the ambiguity volume actually gets reduced because it's canceling out where it doesn't overlap. And so we end up with our resulting ambiguity volume, which is this U shape. It's kind of a weird looking shape, but that's representing all the possible or probable locations that the whale could be located as you incorporate that depth and the different errors involved. And this work was actually accepted for publication Monday. So I'm very excited to have that news because it's been a long run. Thanks. And so another example, just to give you an idea of like why this is actually really important, is because sometimes when we're detecting animals, we just don't know how deep they are, and this provides us a way to account for that. And sometimes it can impact those distance estimates even more, depending on where the whale is relative to the array. So for this example, this is another example of an ambiguity volume on the right here. So this yellow and orange shape is now our ambiguity volume. I set up several different simulation experiments to test the method and see how it worked if I have some known parameters or known values. So I know that the whale is directly below the boat or the array here in this arrow. And I know that it is over 1 kilometer deep below the array. And so normally, using the traditional localization method, you would probably estimate it to be about 1 kilometer away from the vessel versus, right below it. In our case, it's not perfect, but it is better in that it gets it closer to where the true location of the whale is, detecting it at just 250 meters away. And then it provides this error range. So we know that it's between 0 to almost 1.5 kilometers from the array. So it's just again, giving us more information, accounting for more error and the animal depth to help us improve our localization for these different species. Depth is still a little bit tricky for sperm whales. It's just we're lacking, given their characteristics of their clicks and how the array is towed at such a shallow depth, it's hard for us to improve the precision of the depth estimate, since it's pretty much giving an error range from like the surface to where the whale, or just below where the whale is truly located. But that's for improvement, or that can be improved later and even tried out or tested out with different species such as beaked whales, such are other deep divers. And so this information for localizing sperm whales was then input into different, what we call species distribution models. And for sperm whales, that in other cetacean species, we don't normally incorporate passive acoustic data into these models. So it's mainly relying on the visual observations, which again, can limit the sample size that we include. And so really these models and these methods are meant to help us predict both where a sperm whale can occur based on their environmental data. And sometimes these models can also estimate density or how many animals are in a certain area given the environmental information. And so, yeah, it helps us in the whole point being it helps us understand their distribution patterns and their habitat use and get a better idea about their ecology. And so this map on the right is 4 years worth of line transect survey data for sperm whales. And then, yeah, the gray lines are just the different transect lines that we followed for these different surveys with the different colors representing each year. So you can see that there's not really a distinct pattern to where they're distributed. So that's why we had to do this, use these statistical methods to help quantify that and get a better sense of, okay, how can we describe their distribution? Because it's really not obvious when you just plot them on the map like that. And so incorporating the acoustic data with the habitat data is really important for those species that aren't normally seen as often or can be detected acoustically a lot of the time as well. And for sperm whales, it's kind of interesting because you can actually use their acoustic characteristics to distinguish their behaviors, because they do produce 4 click types based on what they're doing underwater. And so I divided into foraging and non-foraging clicks to build a couple of different models, which I'll show you some results of. So for the foraging whales, and those are the ones producing those regular clicks and also a different type of click that they call creeks. With all of the acoustic data, we were able to predict these foraging whales in sort of higher density groups. Of the red color is where you would potentially encounter more foraging sperm whale groups compared to the blue areas of the map. And this is a Hawaiian Islands again. The outline is the Hawaiian exclusive economic zone. So just kind of the area that we're responsible for managing. And so the environmental data that we found to be important for predicting foraging whale presence was the temperature at 584 meters. And that's a very specific depth because that was a modeled, or that was a modeled data set that was kind of their depth bins. And that falls where, or the 584 meters corresponds to where some of their prey items are. So that the prey, including squid and some fish species, tend to reside at that between the 400 and 600 meter zone of the water column. We also found that the standard deviation of sea surface height was important, as well as the log of chlorophyll A, and even just the location, the latitude and longitude of the sperm whales was important. So when we look at this map, we can then compare it to the non-foraging whales, which is very different. We have groups that are perhaps higher density of non-foraging whales here in the northwest area of the archipelago. And then the rest of it is lower density. So there's a lot of foraging happening in general compared to, I guess, non-foraging behavior. But it's just an interesting way to use the passive acoustic data to look at how these animals are distributed versus just by using the visual observations alone. And so with that, I leave you with this profound statement that I'm not obviously the only one that has come across this in my work, because the more we learn about stuff, it's just the more questions that come up, and that's what drives us really as scientists. And so, yeah, a lot of this work, there's still a lot of questions that we can address and improve upon, and that's why I love passive acoustic research so much, is that it can actually answer some of those questions that we would not be able to answer otherwise. And this field is constantly advancing, both in the technology side, just being able to record these animals the way that we do now is vastly different from 10 years ago even. And then the analytical side, which is kind of my interest at the moment, is always improving and changing as well. And so, yeah, just a brief acknowledgement, because all the data that I showed, that was really collected by a lot of other people. I was involved with some of those surveys. Oops. But yeah, there's a lot of crew and scientists involved and aboard those NOAA ships during like the month or several month-long cruises. And then different funding agencies helped also with my advisor and other committee members and colleagues helping with these projects. So with that, I will end that.
So Yvonne, you have one question.
Okay.
That came in while you were talking. Do you conduct the transects at the same time each year to determine seasonal changes?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Do you conduct the transects at the same times each year to determine seasonal changes?
Yeah, we do have some that are, let's see, we tend to conduct them in Hawaii at the similar times of year, but we don't do it every year because we have to, say, go over to the Marianas or Guam or other parts of the region. So there's about 3 different surveys alone within the Hawaiian archipelago that we conducted. And so, yeah, we can go from August just to December. So that's like a sort of a short seasonal trend or seasonal window, but we have 3 years worth of that data, so of that same time frame. So that's how we can also look at it.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Yvonne. Good stuff. And Yvonne and I got to tow hydrophone arrays around the Gulf of Mexico soon after the Gulf Deepwater Horizon. And whenever the sperm whales would start diving, the maps would go weird. And so that Z-axis was always perplexing. And good on you for figuring all that out with just a single string of hydrophones, not a tetrahedral array and all that mess. So cool. Okay.
And
So now we get-
congratulations about getting your paper accepted. Excellent.
Yeah.
No, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.
It
What
was,
journal?
Journal of Acoustical Society of America.
Right
Yeah, I
on.
was definitely doing a happy dance Monday.
Bye-bye, virtual. Yeah, it's a long haul. Okay, now we get to hear from Michele about humpbacks in Southeast Alaska.
All right. Let me grab my screen. Can everybody see that okay? Excellent. Thank you guys for hanging in here. I know that it's evening and we're in different time zones and there's a lot going on, and I'm really grateful to be a part of this particular panel and seminar series, and particularly grateful to the folks that spoke before me, because there's a lot of exposition that I can skip. So, you know, first we had Michael, who was talking, who gave us an understanding as to what life underwater sounds like. And then we heard Yvonne, who told us a little bit about how we can use these sounds to be important for management and for conservation, and sort of what the challenges and successes in the more recent case of using acoustics to understand ecology and population dynamics are. And I'm gonna build on that and pivot and talk about behavior. And I am a bioacoustician, but I am also very much a behavioral ecologist. And I marry those two disciplines to try and understand how anthropogenic noise impacts animals, how animals underwater, especially whales and seals, are communicating with each other, and how we can manage our behavior to encourage their resilience. Some species are more resilient than others. Humpback whales, as you'll see in this, appear to be slightly more resilient to some types of noise than other types of noise. And this kind of work really allows us to make decisions. It's important to know that we cannot exist in a vacuum. As much as we might want humans to simply cease and all noise out of the ocean removed for the sake of the whales and the dolphins and the fish and all the other organisms that are down there, that's just not practical. And so part of what drives my research is trying to understand where behavioral thresholds exists so that we can effectively manage human behavior to the benefit of both the animal users that are in the organism, in the ecosystem, and also so we don't cause human mutiny. If we set unattainable goals, then we fail. And I think that it's really, really important that we acknowledge that humans have fundamentally altered the ecosystems, which means we also have the opportunity to change them. We have the opportunity to make good. So I'm going to talk today about humpback whales, and I'm going to give you sort of a brief overview on how humpback whales respond to noise and vessel noise in particular. And then I'm going to dive in and tell you about one study in particular about how humpback whales are changing the way they communicate as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Let me get in the right spot. I also do want to acknowledge that where I do my research in Glacier Bay National Park, that is the homeland of the Huna Tlingit. This work is done with their permission and their collaboration. There are other areas that I will reference in this talk that are the home of Aquan Tlingit, and that is a sacred space where I do my work. So at this point, we all know that marine mammals rely on sound, and they rely on it for basically everything. Communication, foraging, navigation. Sound is the hallmark, it is the benchmark against which marine mammals interpret the world. And an animal that cannot hear is blind, and an animal that cannot speak is invisible. So sound is extremely, extremely important for underwater organisms. But calling behavior, the sounds that animals produce and that marine mammals produce, is also adaptable. So we've seen across marine mammals that very similar to humans, as their environment gets noisy, marine mammals have the ability to call louder, increase their call amplitude, call higher or lower, adjusting their pitch, and also change their call rates, call more or call less in an effort to sort of be heard between the noise or to call enough so they can be heard above the noise. And the properties of the sounds that animals make, so the way that they call, themselves might be a response to environment, whether or not there's ice in the environment. Are those sounds going to bounce? Is it really noisy? Vital life functions, like whether or not this is a breeding sound or whether or not this is a foraging sound. I might need to adjust the properties of my sound to more closely couple it with my prey. But then animals and marine mammals can also and do also adjust their calling behavior in response to us, in response to human activities. And one of the human activities that we see responses in marine mammals to, of course, is anthropogenic noise, which is the purpose of us being here tonight. So I focus my research program really sort of dives into vessel noise. And that's because vessel noise is a pervasive threat to low frequency specialists. It is heard all over the world. There are very few places in the ocean where you cannot detect a vessel for at least some portion of the day. And vessel noise also overlaps with the vocalizations of baleen whales. So in this plot right here, what we have on our x-axis is frequency. So 1 being very low, that's our infrasonic sound that we can't hear, all the way up into our ultrasonic sound that we also can't hear. But inside of this orange box, we have the range where we have humpback whales, bowhead whales, right whales, gray whales, also within the range of human hearing. And then we also have things like super tankers and frigates and submarines. And the way this plot works is that we have that pitch on the x-axis and we have loudness on the y-axis. So the higher up you go, the louder things get. And so in this particular instance, you can see these blue circles, which are all of the light blue are our biologic signals, are a little bit quieter than our red ovals, which are our anthropogenic signals, which means that we have exact overlap between how whales are communicating and these anthropogenic noise sources, which we've already talked about quite a lot today. But we also have things that perhaps humans don't consider quite as much, which are these natural sound sources like rain and wind that also fall into the vocal range of most of our marine mammal species and certainly almost all, if not all, of our baleen whale species. And so one of the questions that I have looked at is, given that baleen whales evolved over evolutionary time, they developed strategies to contend with naturally occurring noise sources like rain and wind. Are they transferring those strategies, which have allowed them to succeed and communicate as the soundscape has naturally changed? Are they transferring those to anthropogenic noise as well? And I study humpback whales, which those of you who are in California are probably quite familiar with. They migrate up your coast. They also forage in your waters. They're a coastal species and they're quite common in California. There's the California, Oregon, Washington stock that will forage off of the Monterey Bay area all the way up into the Seattle area. And so all of these are part of our North Pacific humpback whales. And humpback whales are vocal. They produce a wide range of vocalizations, possibly in combinations of sound that run into the millions of potential unique combinations. They're social. They form relationships that will last upwards of a decade, if not longer. They form long-term bonds that are related to foraging strategies on their foraging grounds. And they have high site fidelity to their maternal foraging grounds where they're able to maintain these relationships. And they're also widespread. Humpback whales are found globally. And I do my work on foraging grounds. So a lot of what I study is similar to what you have off the California coast, in that I study humpback whales when they are eating. And on their foraging grounds, they have this very diverse acoustic repertoire that does include late season song. But mostly what humpback whales are doing on foraging ground is calling. So to anthropomorphize just a little bit, if humpback whales have calls, which are sort of these little units, and they also have song, calls can be combined to make a song, similar to the way that we might combine words to make a song. So calls are the sort of subunit that makes up the foundation of humpback whale communication, and that can be expanded upon in order to make these more complex singing behaviors. But it's really important to note that unlike song, which is only sung by males and dominates on breeding grounds, calls or non-song vocalizations are produced by everyone. Male whales, female whales, baby whales, geriatric whales, juvenile whales. And so for a long time, we have been studying the voice of the humpback whale, and we've sort of touted it as this sort of magical, wonderful thing. We're only listening to about 30% of the population when we're listening to songs, which means that we're only really understanding the acoustic behavior of a very small demographic. And so what happens when we listen to all of them? What happens when we give voice to the entire population? And humpback whales do respond to vessel noise. And we've been studying humpback whales and their vocal responses to vessel noise in Southeast Alaska since 2011. And that was when we first dropped a hydrophone to try and quantify the humpback whale repertoire in Southeast Alaska. Prior to that, we didn't have a quantitative catalog of the sounds that humpback whales made. So this is a relatively new field of study. And one of the things that we learned when we dropped a hydrophone array in the water in Southeast Alaska is that humpback whales, similar to killer whales and humans, will call louder as their environment gets louder. So you can see that in this plot here. We have ambient noise on the x-axis, that's just how loud the environment is. And we have source level, which is call loudness, on our y-axis. And so that's going to tell us how loud the call is. And you can also see here that I have two different colors. I have red, which means there's no vessel present, and green, which means yes, there's a vessel present. So I wanted to know whether or not the Lombard effect just applied to natural sounds, or did the Lombard effect, that process by which an animal calls louder as their environment gets noisier, did that also apply for anthropogenic noise? Were they able to transfer that strategy? And the answer is absolutely. That is a transferable strategy. They call louder regardless of what the noise source is. But we also know that humpback whales call less when vessel noise come into the area. And this is work that we published in 2018. And what we found is that for every 1 decibel increase in noise, the probability of a humpback whale calling goes down. But here's the important part on this. It doesn't just go down equally based on whether or not that's natural noise or anthropogenic noise. Humpbacks are actually 33% less likely to call if they are acoustically experiencing vessel noise than they are if they're experiencing something like rain or harbor seal vocalizations. So the concept of transferring that strategy doesn't necessarily apply. They seem to have a stronger response to vessel noise than they do to natural sounding noise. So we know that they call louder, and now we know that they call less as their environment gets noisy. But what we also know is that they have non-acoustic responses to noise. When it starts to get noisy, we know based on work that Hannah Blair and Susan Parks did, humpback whales will actively reduce their foraging effort. So they will change their dives and they'll switch from going on foraging dives, like most of the dives that you can see in this plot here. And when they start to experience very high received levels, received level means the amount of noise that is being received by your target, or by, in this case, our tagged animal. As it gets noisier at the point of the whale is less likely to forage. Moreover, we also know that increased anthropogenic noise reduces communication space. So we have modeled this in Glacier Bay National Park, and we have seen as much as a 60% reduction in the distance that a call will travel as the ambient noise goes up. And that's true whether or not it's anthropogenic noise or natural noise. So overall, we know that humpback whales have some strategies for maintaining communication in the face of changing soundscapes, but we also know that they are not impervious, that they do have behavioral responses, and then there are physical responses that they have no control over. They reduce their foraging effort, and as it gets noisy, the physics of the situation tells them they simply can't communicate over the same distances. But what about other types of communication? What about the more subtle and complex ways that these animals are communicating? So humpback whales in Southeast Alaska produce calls that fall into one of 4 vocal classes. And we know they produce at least 16 unique call types. It's likely much, much more. And within these different call classes, these calls serve different functions. And I'm going to zoom in specifically on one call called the whoop call. And I didn't embed any sound in this talk because I wasn't brave enough, but this call sounds like, and it's a very common call. This call we have found persists across generations. We have documented this call in grandmother, mother, and granddaughter whales. We have documented this call in Southeast Alaska in 1976 when our population numbered in the hundreds. And we are still hearing this call today in 2021 when our population is in the many thousands. But moreover, more than just persisting across generations, this call is also shared by whales worldwide. Humpback whale populations that have been genetically isolated from anywhere from 2 to 3 million years and are geographically discrete, so they would have to cross the Panama Canal in order to interact, they share a call type. These are animals that have very little genetic interrelatedness in the modern world, and yet they're producing the same sounds. And this sound, this whoop, is the sound that they are producing the most. So in addition to that, these whoops appear to occur in bouts of countercalling. One whale calls and another whale responds, and one whale calls and another whale responds. And so we think that this call serves a really, really important function. We think that this is a contact call, and it's likely, although we haven't done the math on it yet, that this call also contains identifying information. And this is going to be important in a minute when we talk about COVID and noise. But we needed to test it. Before we could start saying humpback whales are changing how they communicate and why they communicate, we needed to really get at the heart of call function. And so we conducted a playback study, and I'm going to unpack this kind of crude graph for you. What we did is we went to Southeast Alaska and we went out on a small boat and we took a speaker with us. And we went out and we conducted a before, during, after control impact study. So we had these 3 periods, before, during, and after. In our before period, we would go out, we would count all the whales, we would locate where they all were on the surface of the water, and we'd play nothing. In the during period, we'd count all the whales, we'd mark where they were on the surface of the water, and we would play something. And in the after period, we'd count all the whales, we'd locate where they were above the water, and we'd play nothing again. What we played in that during period was either a control sound, which was sound of ambient noise recorded in Southeast Alaska, or it was a series of humpback whale whoops that were repeated at random intervals between 10 seconds and 1 minute 10 times. And then we documented what the calling rate, calls per whale per minute, actually in this case, it's actually calls per whale per 10 minute, whether or not they called back. Did we see an increase in call rates? And what we found was 100% of the time that we called to the whales, we saw an increase in the number of calls that we heard back. And that was true during these whoop trials. During our control trials, it was completely random. There was no pattern and there was no significant difference between periods, so that before, during, or after, but there was a significant difference between when we played the control and when we played the whoop. So what we know now is that we have a call that is serving a contact calling function, that it is persistent in the humpback whale repertoire, and that it appears to be innate. There it is. That's our whoop call. And so what I wanted to know, once those studies were done, and we had this sort of foundation of some of the things that humpback whales were saying to each other and why, was what did COVID do to this? Did we see a shift in communication? We know that during the pandemic that globally noise dropped. It dropped by as much as 50%. We also know that the wildlife responded, that as human activity declined, wildlife moved into corridors they hadn't been in, their activity changed, the reports of people listening to birds went up, people started going out on trails and seeing animals, and animals responded. We also know that lots of researchers, myself included, tried to sort of jump on this natural experiment. What happens when you take people out of the equation? And so we started looking at things like stress, similar to the Susan Parks and Roz Rollins study that we heard about earlier. And we also started listening to see what were the reductions in noise that we found associated with the pandemic. And in Southeast Alaska, where I do my work, this is particularly pertinent because one of the things that happened during the pandemic was that we stopped having cruise ships. Cruise ships are a major source of ocean noise and a major source of ocean noise in Southeast Alaska. And in 2020, we had 0 ships. So I wanted to see how the noise changed during 2019, which was a normal year in 2020. And then also see whether or not we had a shift in that repertoire based on the pandemic. So did they change how much they were or were not contact calling? and then compare this to some of our pre-industrial 1976 data before tourism was really big in Alaska. So we dropped a hydrophone here in Southeast Alaska, and we recorded both in 2019 and in 2020 in August and also into early September. And I then extracted noise values from all of these recordings in 5-minute bins in the range with which humpback whales generally are communicating. And I annotated and classified all of the sounds across 3 different times of day. So 9 a.m., which is typically when a cruise ship would be present, 3 p.m., which would be our mid-afternoon time, and then at 9 p.m., which is right around sunset when our whales are often very acoustically active. And I did this for both 2019 and 2020. And so what we found when we looked at median noise values and our sort of high 99% noise values is that during COVID, we actually had our noise decrease by 3 times. So 2019 was on average 3 times louder than 2020. And that's interesting in its own right. That's important. But if you looked at the mean difference in daily 99th percentile noise level, so that's indicative of our noisiest times of day when, say, a cruise ship might be heading over our hydrophone, we had 14 decibel change in those average loud times between 2020 and 2019. Now, if you convert that to the perception scale, what that means is that it was approximately 25 times louder in 2019 than it was in 2020 on average during those noisy parts of the day. And we also found that in 2019, we had a much higher range of variability than we did in 2020. Our noisy parts were noisier, and our average noise values were a little bit noisier. And so you can see that here in the numbers. Overall, our median noise values in 2019 were 93.5. 2020, they dropped to 91. And I'll remind you that decibels are on a log scale, so these are actually meaningful differences. 2019 was sort of noisier all around. And then in 2020, we even had slightly quieter minimum noise levels. And so I wanted to see what the sort of temporal patterns of this were. And let me unpack this plot for you because it's not overly intuitive. What I have on my x-axis is time of day, and what I have on my y-axis is date. And these are colored by loudness. So you can see that color bar over on the right. So what I have up in front of us is the sort of a soundscape plot from 2019. This is all of the data that we collected, and each one of those boxes is a 5-minute bin with a noise value. You can see these 2 bright periods of day that happen at about 8, 9 a.m. and then happen at about 3, 4 p.m. This coincides perfectly with the entrance and exits of cruise ships. Cruise ships come into the bay in the morning, pass by our hydrophone, they go, they look at the glaciers, they turn around, and they have to come back. Glacier Bay is a one-way street. You can't get out the other side. Now, if you compare that to 2020, there's no discernible patterns in noise here. We have a couple really bright spots that we identified as being storms, but there is no diel pattern associated with vessel traffic or calling behavior. So what we see is that really 2019, these big patterns in noise were driven by the presence of ships, and in 2020, they were a little more sporadic and driven by natural causes. And overall, when we went through and annotated the presence and absence of both whales and vessels, what we found was that there wasn't really that much of a difference in how many times we found a whale. 57% of the time we found whales in 2019 and 52% of the time we found whales in 2020. And there were some differences that I should acknowledge in the number of whales that were present. But more meaningfully, 53% of the time that we listened to data in 2019, we heard vessels, and only 21% of the time did we hear vessels during the pandemic. So none of this is surprising. We expected to see a reduction in vessel noise, and we did see a reduction in vessel noise. But what about how the humpback whales are actually communicating with each other? So humpback whales in Southeast Alaska don't actually call that much. They're relatively soft-spoken. But we did find 305 calls over our 44-day time period, remembering that I'm only annotating a small portion of the day. And when we looked at 2019 versus 2020, you can see that there are some differences in the proportions in the calls. There's a lot more red in 2020 than there is in 2019 than there is in 2020. And so we quantified how many different call types we heard, and we heard 13 call types in 2019 and 12 call types in 2020. But before we jump too far into that, I want to caution us. Animals in general don't have discrete language the way that humans do. They don't have representational sound. So there is no humpback whale call that means fish. And in fact, the humpback whale repertoire is graded. So the lines that we are putting between call types are in some way arbitrary. They're statistically meaningful, but we're not certain yet if they're ecologically meaningful. So we need to be very careful when we interpret call richness. Really, the difference between 12 call types and 13 call types is ecologically equivalent. But what we did see, as expected, was that the dominant call type was this whoop call that persists across space and across time, that is the contact call. Now, if you look at the proportion of contact calls in 2019, our noisy year, versus the proportion of contact calls in 2020, our quiet year, you see a fairly striking difference. You see that we have more contact calling in 2019 than we do in 2020. And the question is this because 2019 was noisier, or is there just interannual variation? So we know that our repertoire shifted. 66% of our calls in 2019 were contact calls, but only about half of the calls in 2020 were. And what we also saw was that in general, we had a difference in call complexity. The spectrogram that I have up in front of us, a visual representation of sound, is of calls in 2020. And you can see there's a whole lot going on in this screen. We have swaps and whoops and growls and groans, lots of black on there. If you look at this is a spectrogram of the exact same time of day in 2019, when we have these three little contact calls. We have a whoop, some empty space, and another whoop. You can also see those two horizontal lines. Those horizontal lines are vessel noise. So whereas, just to go back, in 2020, we had this very complex acoustic interaction. In 2019, we had this very simple acoustic interaction. The level of complexity in the acoustic interaction has gone down, presumably as a function of noise. But I did want to know if it was noise and not year. And so I subset my data another way. Instead of subsetting the data according to which year it was from, I subset the data according to how noisy it was. So we pulled out a box plot, we looked at our quantiles, we said how noisy is this environment, and we determined that anything above 97 decibels was pretty high for this region, and anything below 87 decibels is pretty low. Everything in the middle is average. And then we did the same thing. We looked at these call proportions. And you can see here on the far left that in high noise, those LFH calls, those are our contact calls, they dominate the acoustic repertoire. And as it gets quieter, we get more complexity. We get call types from different call classes. So abundance of contact calling when it's noisy, less contact calling when it's quiet. Moreover, we compared this to data that we had from 1976, which was before we had really big industrialization in Southeast Alaska. And you can see that we have almost identical patterns. 1976 very much looks like a low noise year, where we have kind of equivalent amounts of other little pulsed calls and tonal calls and some context calls mixed in there, but they're not dominating the repertoire. So what did we find? We found that there was a difference in noise values, and this is likely due to a reduction in cruise ships. We also found that communication changed during the pandemic, that the call richness didn't change, but call use did, that contact calling was reduced in 2020. It's also possible, although I didn't go into this in this talk, that foraging calls were changed too. We also know that this is at least partially driven by noise, that noise described the repertoire more than year did. And after controlling for noise, the repertoire actually remains the same across years. We also know that qualitatively, we're seeing a return to pre-commerce conditions, that we're seeing this sort of match to this 1976 data, and that calling behavior in our low noise conditions mimics behavior prior to large-scale Alaskan tourism. And so to build on this, we have hydrophones in the water as we speak. We are currently listening for our third year in the row in both Glacier Bay and also in Juneau, Alaska. And those hydrophones will get pulled up on October 6th, barring terrible weather. And we will look at both the before, the during, and the after to see whether or not our humpback whales have returned to pre-pandemic conditions, or whether or not this generation of whales, which just experienced possibly the quietest summer in their lifetime, whether or not that acoustic complexity seems to be maintained in 2021. So with that, I would like to thank you very much for sticking around and listening to me talk. I also want to thank the National Park Service, who is a partner in this all the donors to the Sound Science Research Collective who led this work, the funding from the Kaylee and Cornell Center for Conservation Bioacoustics, and the Cornell Atkinson Center for Sustainability, who very lovingly gave us a grant so that we could buy some hydrophones and keep this work alive. Ooh, all right.
Okay, we have a question for you in the chat, which is long. So do you want it? Could you see your chat, Michelle?
Yeah, I can see my chat.
Why don't you go ahead and read it, and then
All
we
right.
can answer Mariana's question.
Okay, so you mentioned that humpback whales change their foraging effort when vessel noise is present. Do I think noise directly affects the behavior? That noise affects their prey? Oh, these are great questions. Those will be dispersed. All right. The answer is potentially both, depending on what type of vessel it is. Humpback whales certainly will change their behavior whether or not prey is present or not. And we know that because they'll change their behavior on migratory corridors, and they'll also change their behavior on breeding grounds where they're not foraging. However, this question about whether or not noise is bothering the prey itself, and that's why humpback whales are altering their behavior, or if it's affecting the whales, depends on whether or not the prey are being actively hunted by the whales, and if the prey are being actively hunted by the vessels, whether they're being fished upon. Michael will actually, I think, possibly have some to say about this, and Jeff maybe as well, but you have to think about hearing in fish. Hearing in fish is very different from hearing in humans, and different also from hearing in whales. And things like krill, which is a primary food source for humpback whales, may or may not actually be able to hear vessels. That might not fall into their range of hearing. Similarly, loud noises actually are a little bit more difficult for small critters to hear. Quiet noises are easier for small critters to hear, and this has something to do with the physics of sound. I've told folks this anecdote before, but this is one of my all-time favorites, and I can't remember exactly what the physics are, but ants, for example, are an invertebrate species. They hear based on the vibrations of these tiny hairs that are on their exoskeleton. If you are to shout at an ant, it cannot hear you. But if you whisper to the ant, it will. And this has to do with the energy of the call and the way that the call bounces. And so for small animals like krill, it is unlikely that krill are significantly impacted by vessel noise in such a way that they would have a behavioral response. It's much more likely that they would have a physiological response or a stress response. Herring, on the other hand, can absolutely hear in the frequency range of vessels. And particularly because they are actively fished in Southeast Alaska, it is likely that they could have a response to boats. In the North Atlantic, where the foraging study was done, they were feeding mostly on sand lance, and sand lance is a benthic prey, and their anti-predator response is to sink down into the water. So I don't know that there would be a strong change in humpback whale behavior based on changing prey, since they're doing a lot of benthic feeding down there anyway. But I think both of those are great questions. And it, without a doubt, we know that fish species and invertebrate species and squid species are deeply affected by anthropogenic noise. In fact, for squid, which are a primary food source for odontocetes, anthropogenic noise will cause them to stop breeding. It will cause instantaneous and spontaneous death in some species. It will also result in anti-predator responses. And so prey are certainly impacted by anthropogenic noise, and that is a major issue as well. Is any effort being made to engineer methods for cruise ships to produce less noise? Cruise ships, no. Whale watching vessels, yes. So in Iceland, where I also do some work, they actually just released an electric whale watching vessel with the intention of reducing anthropogenic noise. My hope is that in the future, cruise ships will follow suit. Right now, those ships are so expensive to build that I don't think they're going to be revamping anything anytime soon. But technology is absolutely an effective way for us to begin to solve the noise problem.
I'm going to chime in here. The International Maritime Organization is setting up noise standards that are, at this point in time, just guidelines. But there is some discussion about making them regulatory at some point in time. And that would, at some point in time, cruise ships are kind of way down on the food chain of the IMO. But in terms of other ships, Fortunately, there's a correlation between quiet ships and fuel efficiency. So there's actually an advantage to making your ship quieter. But you know, there's a track on this. I mean, IMO has actually been cooperative on this for a long time, about 20 years. One of the challenges, of course, is that the slower your ship is, the less noise it makes, but having voluntary or regulated or mandatory velocities, ship velocities, is something that's it's controversial in the business, particularly when you're moving people around.
Absolutely. There are other strategies too, like caravanning. So sending ships in all at once so that we don't have prolonged noise, because noise isn't additive. You can have two vessels, it doesn't make it twice as loud. There is a lot of evidence that particularly in the North Pacific and the San Juan Island areas, that caravanning vessels and bringing them in little pods reduces ocean noise. So in addition to changing sort of the technology, there are also ways that we can change the activity that would reduce noise. Can you elaborate on call diversity and noise, the evidence of change in emotive content? Thanks, Fred. I haven't looked at it, is the answer. So emotive content in humpback whales is hard to quantify. There's something called motivational structure theory, which shows us, and this is true amongst mammals and birds and lots of terrestrial vertebrates, that there are a suite of acoustic properties that seem to indicate motivation or emotion in animals. So like soft cooey sounds being appeasement, low growly sounds being anger. We can look at this in humpbacks, but we haven't yet. I would say rather than doing this with noise, we are better off doing this based on social context. So looking at high arousal time periods versus low arousal time periods. Because before these animals can begin to convey how they're feeling about something, they have to do things like make initial contact. And so I think that explains why we see this initial contact. But it would be really interesting to look at motivational structure theory and sort of the emotive content of humpback whale calls as a function of whether or not there were cows and calves present, whether or not they were in large aggregations, whether or not they were being attacked by a killer whale, or whether or not they were traveling just all by their lonesome.
Yeah, and then take that onto the breeding ground.
Sure.
Where there's lots of social calls and competitive groups, and
yeah, yeah. So competitive groups are super interesting. I work with Greg Silber, who published a paper in 1986 on the social sounds of humpback whale competitive groups. And we actually have a paper that just got accepted this morning comparing comparing those social calls from 1986, which were the first ones really recorded and documented, with Newfoundland humpback calls. And as it turns out, they're using the same call types, which is really cool. So stronger evidence for this call innateness. And so that's super high arousal. And what we did qualitatively find is competitive groups are using thwoppy, sort of bouncy, seemingly more aggressive, punchier sounds than what we're hearing on foraging grounds. But we haven't actually done the analysis on it. That's just sort of what I think of from like hanging out in my headphones for a long time. And then this last question says, if humpback whales change their songs during the breeding season, how do you identify if they're different stocks or population only by sound? So in general, they do change their song every year. In general, humpback whale songs are unique to a population with some small changes. So there are sort of cultural revolutions where a song will get introduced. But generally, humpback whale populations are well described and they exhibit really high site fidelity. And we can't actually differentiate. So in Southeast Alaska, for example, we have humpback whales that are part of the breeding ground stock that goes to Hawaii. That makes up 97% of all of the Southeast Alaskan humpbacks. But there's also these 3% that hang out in Mexico. And they have a higher protection level than the Hawaii humpbacks do. And so when we do our work, even though it's very unlikely we're going to run into a Mexican humpback, we have to treat all of the whales as if they're of this higher protection status. So identifying humpback sounds by stocks by song alone isn't really necessary because they're so geographically discrete when they're on their breeding grounds, but it's much harder when they're on foraging grounds.
You know, a long-term, you know, kind of longitudinal study we tried to get funded a while back, unsuccessfully, unfortunately, was to look at the song complexity over the years, because they started really recording, for example, in Hawaii, there's a lot of data on song recording, you know, the songs over the years from 1972 when they first started recording, where the ocean noise level from shipping was significantly lower than it is now, and whether or not over years it would actually have decreased the complexity of the calls of the seasonal calls, and it would, you know, basically be consistent with the Lombard effect, where you just kind of say simpler words and you know, and louder. But it would be an interesting correlation now that we can look back on it now, 40 years, 50 years.
I do wonder, how would we tease out song complexity as a function of noise versus song complexity as a function of population growth? So as the population grows, there's so much more opportunity for animals to interact and to culturally exchange information. So how would we know that it was one versus the other?
Well, I mean, but if we have this, if the song is consistent through a season, through a breeding season, then we could actually look at the embellishments, the articulations, the codas, and things like that within the song, and it might reveal a level of complexity that would be consistent with that song as opposed to with the population density.
Yeah, it's a great question.
Do you have any infrasound in frequencies in your recordings from Glacier Bay, et cetera? I'm thinking of Jim Darling's short note on how in competitive groups in the breeding grounds, they recorded at really low, below our hearing range call coming out of the competitive groups. And he speculated that it could very well be from the female in the group. And
yeah, we hear that call. When he put that note out, those of us who've been doing work in Glacier Bay were like, well, yeah, that's a humpback. Because it's not an altogether uncommon call. We call it a bumblebee. And it's really low. It's just at the edge of human hearing. So if you have the right headphones on or a good subwoofer, you can hear it. I wouldn't say it's something that we hear a lot of, but we have definitely recorded that sound. And we do get infrasonic sounds coming from humpbacks. Usually it is more that there is a portion of the call that is concentrated in the infrasonic range, and we could hear most of the call, but not the bass notes. But occasionally it's just these low boomy bits. And actually, going back to Fred's question about emotion, I will tell you guys one other short anecdote. I was out on a boat in Juneau, Alaska, and a pod of killer whales had been in the area, transient killer whales, and they had been pretty well devastating the marine mammal population, which is great for them, really important for their survival. But we only had one minke whale in that area. We'd had the same minke whale in Juneau for about 15 years. And this pod of transient killer whales hunted her and ate her. And I was out on a boat at the time. And as the hunt sort of concluded and they were, eating this minke whale, there were a lot of humpbacks sort of in the distance who had often foraged with this minke. And these humpbacks that had been widely dispersed, we dropped a hydrophone in the water and heard this really low, extremely loud, persistent moan. And it went on for about 45 minutes before we had to pull up our hydrophone and go. But as that occurred, these widely disparate animals aggregated. And they went from being 15 whales spread out across 5 or 6 miles to 15 whales that were all traveling as a single humpback whale unit, which in Southeast Alaska is quite rare unless the animals are foraging. And that sound persisted until we could no longer hear them. And it was in that low, low range. And I've never heard it before, and I've never heard it since. So we don't actually have a recording of it. But presumably, being that low frequency, it would serve a long distance communication function and absolutely sort of fall into that concept of emotive information transfer.
Right. And on the breeding grounds, that whole different context is what's similar to the low frequency elephant calls. Come hither and fight over me.
Yeah, there's a lot of really great parallels between elephants and whales. Yeah, I actually work pretty closely with an artist who has made really beautiful music and documentaries about elephants. And she has requested, can we come to Alaska and play elephant sounds to the whales and see what they do?
That would be really interesting.
Mhm.
Well, we're getting up on almost 2 hours now. So any other questions from the group before we call it a night? I appreciate everybody's time, and the speakers were all amazing. And hopefully you've seen all of your thank yous. Michele, especially, I think Bob pointed out that you're very good at imitating the whale sounds, and we appreciate that.
Certainly.
Any other questions before we close out for the night? All right, looks like we're probably good. Thank you guys so much. We appreciate this. Is a really interesting panel. I like the mix of our speakers, and it really came together nicely to get a good understanding of acoustics and how it's applied in this field. So thank you all. We hope we see you again sometime in the future. And congratulations to both of you who got your papers accepted. With that, we're proud of you.
Yeah.
And thanks,
Yeah.
Mr. Jacobson.
Oh, sure.
Yeah,
that's
Jeff,
really-
Michele, Yvonne, what a delight to be on the panel. You guys, I really appreciate your
I
work.
couldn't agree more. It's exciting and very humbling. Thank you for including me.
Thanks, everybody. Have a nice evening.
Okay,
Take care.
bye for now.